From an engineering standpoint, one of the most important things that you can do is to understand the architecture of your software before you start putting code down. What we have here is a diagram that showcases the logical structure of all of the different systems that are going to exist in this Spyro game. For the most part, it's all here. Some of this may change as we actually start implementing things, but it's important to plan it out so that you have some kind of baseline to deviate from. Otherwise, you'll very quickly end up with spaghetti code, and you'll find it very difficult to maintain and modify your code. So it can be difficult to understand where exactly you want to start, but because this is a cyclical loop of a lot of interacting systems. But let's start with the player character, which is going to be the whole Myro prefab. What I've done here is I have broken down the Myro prefab into a system of 5 components that are responsible for controlling the character. You have a Myro controller that handles external state switches and it ciphers the input for all of the other components that we're using this. So you can do a public bool is something key pressed, and this becomes a single point of truth for, if the charge key is pressed down, it can be right click or left shift, but that is defined inside of this function, and then something like the Myro movement will reference, okay, during the movement, is the shift key pressed, etc. This will work for all of the different inputs that control the player controller. We also have things to set the player to dialogue controls, normal controls, flook, etc. That's all handled within this Myro controller. We also have an ability to set and end what we're calling control variants, which I'll explain later. But control variants are swappable puzzle pieces that contain different behaviors that can be applied to the Myro character. Later on, we'll talk about how they're actually applied, but this is how we will be able to take a fire breath and swap it with a coconut or a fireball. Or if you wanted to get really creative and start doing lightning breath or frost breath, or maybe you just make Spyro spit water. Something like that will all be swappable via this one singular component that uses the derived components. Next, we have Myro Movement. This handles all of your WASD, jumping, gliding, etc. And this is further tweaked by control variants, where, say, if you wanted to fly, then the flight mechanics will take over in place of the standard movement functionality. You'll have the the ability to set like, hey, you got in a minecart. If you remember playing Spyro, there was the trolley sequence. So this is where you would be able to take over and say, oh, instead of WSD movement, you will ride on the trolley and be able to jump and swap tracks. So this is where how you'll be able to swap that out with a control variant. But movement is handled in this Myro movement class. Then you have a Myro animator, which handles all of the animation and interaction with the animators. This is just designed to be a single landing place so that the other scripts can use all of the animation functions very simply. And the camera controller is something that is applied to the main camera, but interacts very closely with the Myro controller. You'll be able to change for dialogue look settings, F-look settings, etc. And lastly, there's going to be a combat system that interacts via a combat interaction entity inheritance, which will enable the same kind of component to take damage for the collectible items and the enemies. There will be one base script that combat functions understand how to interact with, and Myro will have a version of a combat interaction entity. So let's continue this way. The Myro controller will contain Myro ability variants, and that will be Fire Breath, Coconut, Fly, Flight, Charging, Supercharging. A dialogue mode can even be in a controller because it can control the camera, it can control the way that Myro is supposed to move. So ultimately, all of these are going to have their own kinds of controls, and for the ones that are relevant, that are related to actually doing damage to the enemies, you'll spawn what's called a combat interface. A combat interface is something that on trigger enter, it will be able to collide with something, and it will then determine what happens. Essentially, it's going to be looking for combat interaction entities, and it will call the hit combat interaction entity. So what you'll do is you'll override this and call different kinds of functionalities within the interaction entity. Tell it, hey, you've been hit by a fireball, you've been hit by a coconut, this or that. This is going to then be derived, and you'll be able to have different kinds of functionalities. So the fire breath will spawn and go away, but it will appear and it will disappear on its own cadence, and it will contain a fire particle effect. The coconut will fly across. It will actually move on a trajectory and eventually hit an enemy or a wall. The charging will just sit in front of Spyro's head and stay parented to Spyro. And the enemies will attack. They will have some way to attack and swing back and attack other things. So then we get to the combat interaction entity. There's going to be a few different things it can get hit by, and depending on which combat interface it was, it will call a different functionality. So, the fire breath may call hit by normal fire, but the normal fire breath will not call hit with fireball because that's something reserved for something else. We'll have a lot of these different kinds of interactions set in this base combat interaction functionality. And it will also have the ability to say, hey, you have died, and based on how it was derived, for example, the Myro combat, will tell the Myro controller that you have died. You have an override of the die function. In fact, I will add this here. Public override void die. As you can see, just by sitting here talking about this, I've realized, oh, I had an oversight, and it helps me to refine my actual strategy for talking about how this project's going to be put together. Likewise, the base collectible containers, these are the jars and the clay pots that end up dropping gems, or the critters that drop food that Spyro uses to get health back. These are all things that will derive from the base collectible container. There will be pots that will drop collectibles such as gems, health pickups, orbs, etc. Um, the base collectible will be something that interacts with the player when you go and pick it up, and you will derive different kinds of components. So gems will give you money, health will give you health, orbs and souls will all count towards their own collectible. And these will all then let the resource tracker know you have collected this object. Additionally, you'll have pots that, they will drop a collectible. In most cases, this is going to be a gem. But fire pots and charge pots, they'll have an override for what kind of damage they are taking. So they will override the combat interaction entity. And so if you've been hit by a normal fire, then the charge will not die. It will maybe turn red. And you've got enemies that have AIs that spawn enemy combat interfaces. You have a basic animator that is all of the other animators derive from, and that will just affect the way that the enemy walks around and looks visibly. But you might have different kinds of animation settings for each model, so you will derive, and the other animations will be different. An enemy combat will um, that derives from the combat interaction entity. So enemies will attack with a combat interface, and they will take damage back with a combat interaction. And that's how the pots, the enemies, and the different kinds of abilities will all interface together. This is important because you can keep encapsulation with all of your different systems, and you know exactly how each system will interact. The the abilities spawn combat interfaces that interact with interaction entities, and your AIs spawn those combat interfaces, but they're attached to objects with interaction entities. So this way you can endlessly expand on the kinds of enemies that you have or kinds of abilities that you have, but you have a finite number of systems that are interacting. So you're on a very solid foundation from a logical standpoint to just keep expanding and keep being creative with your frayed ends of logic, where you can start having a whole lot of fun with your custom kinds of combat interfaces and your custom abilities, because you have this logic set up in a very tight knit way. It's understandable and it all comes back together. This also makes it very easy to track down bugs because with single or very limited, well-defined interaction endpoints, then if something's going wrong, you have very definite spots to check what's going on. Additionally, for the NPC dialogue, there will be a way the player will trigger the dialogue. You'll just go into a trigger, it will trigger the dialogue, use the message system, which will display the dialogue from a messaging standpoint. Sometimes you'll display the yes or no dialogue. Do you want to lower the drawbridge? Yes or no. If you spend yes, it will end up spending your money, but we'll get to that. Then you end the dialogue and it goes back. There will be a data type that will contain the string and an optional audio clip to say things. And at the very end, it will post the NPC interaction sequence. And in this case, you will have an option to open the bridge. Maybe you spawn a minigame, or maybe you trigger the end of the level and the portal rises up and you can walk in and end your level, move on to the next area. This is all of the logic along with a set of systems, a scene changer, an audio manager, a UI manager that contains a message system, as well as the collectible UI and a resource tracker so that we know how many resources we have. This is, in a nutshell, the entirety of a Spyro game and how the Spyro logic functions. And this is the blueprint that we are going to follow in order to create our Myro game.